Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome again to Syriana Analysis. I'm your host, Kevork Almassian. Thank you very much for tuning in to today's live streaming. I appreciate you all. Before I continue in this live streaming, I need your help or support or advice. I am going to arrange a crowdfunding for a Syrian family in Aleppo. They were kicked out from the city of Raqqa a few years ago when ISIS occupied the city and kicked them out of the city and took over their apartment. And they are in very dire situation nowadays in Aleppo. And we would like to help this family to buy a small car, cost $2,000, so that their family, their men, can work and provide a livelihood for his family. So I want to organize a crowdfunding, right? But most of the crowdfundings that are based in the United States or in Canada are following the sanctions of the US regime against Syria. Therefore, they cancel your crowdfunding when you organize it. Therefore, I would like to ask for your opinions. If you know a crowdfunding platform that I can organize a crowdfunding on it without problems. Now, let's jump to today's live streaming. I'm joined by Vanessa Beeley. She is a Syria-based independent investigative journalist and also my friend. And Hekmat Aboukhater, he is a Syrian journalist, also contributing for the Grey Zone, the host of What the Hekmat and Conversations with Dissidents on YouTube, and a fellow countryman. Hello, Hekmat. Hello, Vanessa. Thank you very much for being with me today in this live streaming. Today's topic is very important, especially with the news that we received from the United States that the House of Representatives, they approved a law or an act that called the Assad Regime Normalization Act. And we're going to discuss this and its implications on the Syrian people. It is widely known that Israel has provided assistance to the Syrian opposition, including the armed insurgents near the Golan Heights since 2011. However, instead of issuing or adopting a law that bans normalizing genocide nowadays in the Gaza Strip or against the Palestinians, the House of Representatives, led by the friends and allies of Netanyahu, approved the Assad Regime Anti-Normalization Act. Vanessa, if I start with you this conversation, the Forefront organization, which took credit for preparing the bill, is a US-based Syria Emergency Task Force. It's a very fancy name. What is the nature of this organization? What are its affiliations, and who funds their work? I was checking today the taxing system in the United States. There are some of the information that is already public. And this is the Syrian Emergency Task Force. They have revenues of $1.5 million in 2022. They have total assets around $1 million. And as you can see, the funding of this organization is increasing exponentially in the past years.
Yeah, it's probably also worth doing an investigation into FARA, I think, the foreign agents that checks on foreign money coming into American-based companies, because almost certainly the British government and probably EU nations are funding SETF. The founder of SETF was Moaz Mustafa. If you look at his history, during the season of Arab Spring, the orchestrated Arab Springs across the Middle East, he was involved in the US-based branch of the Egyptian opposition party. He was the executive director of the Libyan Council of North America, and he was the political director of the Libyan Emergency Task Force before he was involved in the Syrian Emergency Task Force. But also, if you then look at the advisory board and the trustees, you see a revolving door with AIPAC. For example, you have Toby Dershowitz, who is, the FDD, I can't remember what it stands for. Now maybe Hekmat can remember. My mind has gone blank. But I mean, she was the media relations director at AIPAC itself. She's basically set up the Dershowitz Foundation. She's a neocon, a very proud neocon, yes. And then if you go up to I think it's the Board of Trustees, you'll see Ambassador Stephen Rapp.
Mm-hmm.
Now, when you look at Rapp's involvement with, for example, the Caesar files that have been extensively debunked by independent media outlets, particularly by journalist Rick Sterling, Rapp was involved in, let's say, procuring the Caesar files and creating the propaganda around the Caesar files. But he's also on the board of commissioners for an organization called CIJA, the Commission for International Justice and Accountability, which again has this same revolving door with neocon, with British military intelligence, and is involved again in procuring very suspect files that criminalize the Syrian government. So what you see is this constant merging of organizations and individuals to effectively push through American foreign policy that, of course, is the balkanization and the destabilization of Syria and the removal of the Syrian government and the presidency, basically, and the funding of terrorism in order to do so, which, of course, as you've mentioned, is backed by Israel. And one thing I do want to point out, which is very important to show the absolute insidious nature of SETF, right? Recently, they announced in June 2023, Operation Syrian Oasis. Now, what does this involve? This involves the liberation of the Rukban refugee camp, which is under the control of the illegal US Al Tanef military base on the border with Jordan in the southeast of Syria.
Yes.
And what is extraordinary, even on the SETF website, they make it very clear that they are bringing aid into the Rukban camp from the military base, the US military base of Ain al-Assad in Anbar, Iraq, which is then brought into Al Tanef military base, where the US is recruiting and training terrorist groups that include ISIS. Rukban is also described as a recruitment and training center by civilians that have managed to escape the occupation of Rukban by American-backed forces and terrorist groups. And of course, what people will not understand is that there's a 55-kilometer exclusion zone established by the US around this entire area. So for SETF to be making, the claim that they liberated Rukban camp when effectively it was occupied by the United States, and the United States was preventing Syrian and Russian aid entering the camp and imprisoning and holding Syrian civilians hostage. SETF is being very the fact that they're bringing so-called aid in from a US military base in Iraq to a US military base in Syria that is then being funneled to a terrorist recruitment and training center in Rukban. I think people have the rationale to be able to understand what that connection
exactly means. Hekmat, here, if you want to sum up the content of this bill, the Anti-Assad Normalization Act, and its implications on what they call the Syrian regime vis-a-vis the 50 million people living in government-held areas. How can we evaluate and assess the impact on the Syrian regime and on the Syrian people?
Yeah, can I share my screen real quick?
Yeah.
All right. Can you see HR 3202?
Yes.
Yeah, so HR 3202 was introduced on the 13th of February, and yesterday was voted almost unanimously with only 32 votes, no votes, majority Democrats. It's the technical term is Assad Regime Anti-Normalization Act of 2023. And the idea behind it is three-pronged. It's anti-normalization, increase in sanctions, and essentially bullying the United Nations. So let me go through these really quickly and give the audience an understanding of what this bill entails. So the main crux of this bill is essentially trying to prohibit any of the regional state actors in the Middle East from normalizing or from potentially having any form of economic interaction with the state of Syria. And as you can see here, the bill requires the Secretary of State to submit a report on the strategy to counter actions of foreign governments seeking to normalize relations with the Assad government. So this report, what it will look into, this is from the bill itself, it will look into any diplomatic meetings at the ambassadorial level between the Syrian government and any of the following governments, from Turkey, United Arab Emirates, Egypt, all the way down to Lebanon. And additional to that, it will take into account a full list of any transaction that between the Syrian government and any of these countries that exceeds $50,000. So essentially, it's a tool to tattletale on the Syrian government and wage a very threatening finger against the potential state actors in the region that could potentially normalize with the Syrian government. And the secondary aspect here is enforcing the Caesar Act sanctions and turning the quota of investment in Syria from a broad understanding of anything that could be substantial to the Syrian government to $50,000 or more. And of course, as you can see, it targets sham wings. It targets the Syrian Trust Fund, which is a Syrian government organization. And finally, it targets the Syrian Arab Red Crescent,
Wow.
which is essentially telling a country that their Red Cross is no longer going to be able to receive grants or funding from international organizations. And finally, as I mentioned before, it's United Nations essentially putting on punitive measures to make sure that the United Nations, which is one of the only organizations, the only multilateral institutions that are still allowed to operate in Syria and provide essential humanitarian aid, putting one more obstacle in their spokes and their operations in in Syria.
Mm-hmm.
So this is a broad understanding of what this bill is, Kevork. But my personal opinion, having written about HR 3202 back when it was initially thought of in August of last year, I think there's a silver lining here, because the initial draft of this bill asked for the extension of the Syria Civilian Protection Act of 2019 to 2032. This was struck out of this now modern bill. And additionally, what I see in this language versus the language that initially put forward in August, now it's more of a threatening finger wagging, essentially. It doesn't have any concrete language. It doesn't have any language that explains exactly what will happen to these governments that potentially are to go into business with the Syrian government. All it does is says that it will compile a list. Okay, the United States can compile the list and can do whatever it wants with it. And the other silver lining for specifically the United Nations, this is nothing new. The United Nations has been constantly under pressure from the United States government, from Israel, from most of the West, to treat certain countries like Venezuela, Cuba, Syria, Botswana, Zimbabwe in a deferential manner, to look into their exchanges, to scrutinize any form of economic activity that's happening in these countries. This is nothing new, and the United Nations is very well capable of dealing with the bullying tactics of the United States and their representatives in the United Nations. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that there is a little bit of a silver lining here, that this bill, the way it was contrived initially, seems to have been watered down now that it's actually reached Congress.
Vanessa, there are two leading figures that I have seen, one of which is Representative French Hill, and the other one is Joe Wilson. And they have made very clear their position as well for being pro-Israel and in the continuation of the onslaught against the Palestinians of Gaza, and even they were condemning the ICJ during after the provisional measures. I mean, here, what do we know more about the French Hill and Joe Wilson? What are their motivations? I mean, the timing of it, right? And their affiliations, if you can tell us a little bit about them.
Yeah, well, I mean, French Hill, I know a little bit more about. I mean, he's the representative for Arkansas, and he very recently, and I think it was August 2023, escorted by the Syrian Emergency Task Force, just as John McCain was in 2013 by Moaz Mustafa. He went to northwest Syria under the control of Al-Qaeda and various affiliates, and he was accompanied by the Syrian Emergency Task Force during that visit. But French Hill was also responsible for the introduction of the Captagon Act, which was brought in 2021. It was originally known as the Countering Assad's Proliferation, Trafficking and Garnering of Narcotics Act. And of course, it was, it was put together really to present the Syrian state as a failed narco state. And present the fact that allegedly President Assad and the Assad family were personally involved in the manufacture and trading of Captagon, which is an amphetamine drug that was known to have been used by the various armed groups, including Al-Qaeda, Nusra Front, and ISIS. I myself interviewed people that had survived ISIS and Al-Qaeda attacks and who described the effects of Captagon on the terrorist fighters. Equally, in the terrorist attack in Al-Qaa in Lebanon, a Christian community, by extremist factions that had fled Syria and were camping as refugees on the doorstep of Al-Qaa in southern Lebanon, also carried out a multiple suicide bombing attack. And again, there, it was described to me the effects of Captagon, which effectively prevent the body's adrenaline inhibitor working, so the adrenaline keeps rising to the point where you don't feel pain, you don't feel any effect, you don't feel fear, etc. And so the fact that French Hill is involved, he actually introduced this act, the Captagon Act, and that I think preceded the Anti-Normalization Act. I could be wrong, but I think it preceded it. So the two together formed this kind of pincer action against both the Assad presidency and the state itself, in order to further isolate Syria and, as Hekmat said, to prevent normalization with Syria. But I also agree with Hekmat that I think it's a little bit that wonderful Arabic saying of the dogs are barking long after the caravan has left, right? Because the normalization was actually ongoing long before the Anti-Normalization Act was actually pushed through Congress. And so as regards Joe Hill, I tend to see all of these. Oh, and the other thing, French Hill was reported to have also been in touch with the leaders of the separatist movement in Sweden and encouraging that movement to push through their separatist ideals, which of course were being backed by Israel and by the United States. Joe Wilson has a similar background. I did notice that in 2013, he voted against the bombing of Syria when I was kind of flicking through his profile. But what is clear is that this is a bipartisan attack against Syria. And I also perceive it as a bipartisan attack against what is perceived as an enemy of Israel.
Yes.
Right. Because when we look at the AIPAC representatives, the neocon representatives that are working within the Syrian opposition movement based in the United States, it becomes very clear who is supporting the overthrow of President Assad. And we need to go back to 1996 to the clean break doctrine, which was a paper actually commissioned by then, I think it was Prime Minister Netanyahu, to effectively describe the balkanization of the Middle East, but in particular Syria, into sectarian statelets that would enable Israel to control better the Middle East and to secure statelets that would be sympathetic to Israel in the future. And so, I think basically what we have to read from this is that these Republican and Democrat representatives are doing Israel's work in the region.
Yes.
And let me just add, Kevork, really quickly.
Yeah.
Arm Joe Wilson, he is funded to the tune of $41,000 by AIPAC. And this was only 2023 to 2024. So it seems very clear that, they were interested in him for this 1 year alone. And the one other thing that I would add that, in my view, is another silver lining here is that when I initially saw this, and you remember we talked about this almost a year ago, and I told you it's going to be voted almost unanimously. It almost is unanimous, but there were still 32 representatives who voted no against it. And those representatives, some of them are on the Republican side, it's Gates, Thomas Massey, and MTG. And on the Democrat side, some firebrands like AOC, Bush, Bowman, and Jayapal. So it seems like there is some sort of populist movement in the United States that is actively influencing some anti-interventionist decisions in Congress. Beforehand, I would tell you in 2016, 2017, I would have expected this one to be like a 98-2 with a Rand Paul voting against. We're going to see that in the Senate, but it was a surprising outcome in the House.
Yeah. Hekmat, I'm going to show a photo from this meeting after the bill was adopted. And the representative, Joe, he edited the video. He cut it from here. He didn't show that there is an Israeli flag in the background when he posted it on his account. But someone apparently from the Syrian opposition was not smart enough to post it. So there we can see that there is an Israeli flag on the desk and everybody is standing happily. And the food is, mashallah, is all eaten while the Syrian people is suffering inside Syria. And another tweet that I saw was from the, again, Syria Emergency Task Force. And here I want to ask you, because the Syria Emergency Task Force and the Syrian American Consul, which they blocked me on Twitter, so I cannot check from my main account what they write, both of them congratulated what they call, quote, free Syrians around the world on the adoption of the act. As a Syrian journalist yourself who reported about the impact of the sanctions on Syria, how amused were you when you heard about this act? And maybe share with us your experience with the Syrian American Consul and why they kicked you out from one of their private panels on Zoom.
Yeah, first of all, if you go back to that picture of the meeting that they held with the two Israeli flags, not just one. And you also see on the far right side, it's a Turkish flag, and on top you'll see it's a Ukrainian flag. So it's a who's who of who's supported by American empire, all represented in the one picture. And it was kind of funny that they didn't have the wherewithal to maybe hide the flags before they took this Feeric celebratory picture. Yeah, here in the left corner you see the two Israeli flags.
Yeah.
Yes.
On the far right, you see the Turkish-American flag of brotherly.
Yes, here.
And right under where the zoomed-in picture of the Israeli flag, right next to Muaz's face, to the left, you'll see the Ukrainian flag. So this was quite intriguing to me. But to your other question, when this bill was initially discussed by ACS and the SAC, sorry, both ACS and SAC, and the some of the SETF people were in the same Zoom call back in August. What I finally interjected and said interrupting their Zoom meeting and promptly getting kicked out, is like, what about the 12, 15 million Syrians that are living under, quote unquote, the regime controlled part of Syria? What about these people that you are essentially condemning for decades more of suffering, decades more of not being able to participate in the global free market, decades more of having to suffer from your own vengeful desires to get some sort of retribution from grievances that may or may not be valid? Why are you condemning these generations of your own people in Syria? But then it comes back to this initial idea that we've discussed before, is that the Syrian people are not leading this movement that you saw in this picture in Washington. It's not. It's a few Syrian people like Muaz, as Vanessa described him perfectly, but it's essentially a front for the foreign policy desires of the American empire. It's clearly that. I mean, I'll show if I can later. Dana Stroul famously said that the Middle East director of defense under Biden famously said in 2019, and before getting tapped, and now she's organizing defense policy in the Middle East. She famously said that that the United States is comfortably holding 1/3 of Syria and is holding a card on any form of reconstruction in the country.
I have the video in my hand. Do you want me to play it?
Yeah,
for the
yeah,
audience to have a perspective,
Sure, yeah.
just to show them a perspective of what she said.
Yeah.
This is the video.
The United States still had compelling forms of leverage on the table to shape an outcome that was more conducive and protective of U.S. interests. And we identified 4. So the first one was the 1/3 of Syrian territory that was owned via the U.S. military with its local partner, the Syrian Democratic Forces. Now, this was a light footprint on the U.S. military, only about 1,000 troops over the course of the Syria Study Group's report. And then the tens of thousands of forces, both Kurdish and Arab, under the Syrian Democratic Forces. And that 1/3 of Syria is the resource-rich, it's the economic powerhouse of Syria. So where the hydrocarbons are, which obviously is very much in the public debate here in Washington these days, as well as the agricultural powerhouse. But we argued that it wasn't just about this 1/3 of Syrian territory that the U.S. military and our military presence owned, both to fight ISIS and also as leverage for affecting the overall political process for the broader Syrian conflict. There were 3 other areas of leverage. One is political and diplomatic isolation of the Assad regime, so holding the line on diplomatic isolation, preventing embassies from going back into Damascus. 2 is the economic sanctions architecture. So some of this is part of the maximum pressure campaign of the Trump administration on Iran, but there's a whole suite of both executive and congressional sanctions on Syria and Bashar al-Assad, both for human rights abuses in Syria and to the backers of Assad for their activities in support of him in Syria. And 3 was reconstruction aid. So the United States remains the overall largest single donor of humanitarian aid to Syrians, both inside Syria and refugees outside of Syria. And there was some stabilization assistance in the part of Syria that was liberated from ISIS and controlled via the Syrian Democratic Forces in northern eastern Syria. The rest of Syria, though, is rubble. And what the Russians want and what Assad wants is economic reconstruction. And that is something that the United States can basically hold a card on via the international financial institutions and our cooperation with the Europeans. So we argued that absent behavioral changes by the Assad regime, we should hold the line on preventing reconstruction aid and technical expertise from going back into Syria.
So as you saw just there, this is back in 2019. This is October of 2019. Mm-hmm. And this is the American foreign policy towards Syria and the Middle East in general. So the people at SETF are giving themselves a nice pat on the back today and yesterday and acting like they did something monumental. It's not their policy. It wasn't their policy to begin with. They just were used as a nice facade, a Syrian facade, to enact this policy that's already been in the making, whether they were there or not. So yeah. Just to correct myself on something that I said, she is the top. Sorry, yeah, she's the top Pentagon official for the Middle East desk under the Biden administration.
Exactly, yes. Vanessa, I want to show you a video. Dr. Miller, who was, he wanted to join us today in this conversation. He came under heavy, let's say, criticism on Twitter and other social media platforms because of this video. I want to show you the video first, and let's see his comment now.
Right.
What do you say to those Sunnis who haven't forgotten what's happened in Syria, though?
Well,
I say that because that's the discomfort that we have with Iran.
Sure. Okay. So my best, most kind of friendly way of putting this is to say, get over it. Look, I have a completely different understanding of what happened in Syria than you do, right?
Sure.
But you know, the main enemy, it's not Assad, it's the Zionists. And let's fight about Assad later if you want, right? But we don't need to fight about Assad just now. We need to fight the Zionists. They're the main enemy, and their main support is U.S. imperialism. So let's be clear. You know, we shouldn't have grudging. I'm sorry, I'm speaking as if I'm a Muslim now. There shouldn't be grudging alliances between Sunni and Shia, or between different parts of Shiism and different parts of Sunnism. There should be wholehearted brotherly alliances to get rid of the Zionists. It's the main threat to world peace.
Do you understand the caution, though?
Of course, I understand that.
So, because of this segment, he came under attack by Celine. Celine is, of course, she works in the media desk of the Syria Emergency Task Force, and he replied to her by, of course, raising her background in the foundation, but also here he raised a very good point, in my opinion. And he says, after I won my tribunal, Celine attempted to sabotage my legal fundraiser by whipping up British Sunnis into sectarian hysteria over the failed NATO and Zionist regime change campaign in Syria. Such tactics are part of a US strategy to undermine support for a material resistance to Zionism. It's worked a treat over the past decade. Some British Sunnis still do not know that almost every organization invented to overthrow the Syrian state, from the Emergency Task Force, CIA cutout, to the White Helmets, MI6, was a NATO or Zionist intelligence operation. The days of being duped are over. There are no excuses for ignorance anymore, and there can be no accommodation with US imperialism. Only a coherent anti-imperialism and a consistent anti-Zionism applied globally, from the wars in Sudan and Somalia to Palestine and Syria, will defeat the enemy. I'm going to be very, very honest with you, Vanessa. I mean, I've seen many pro-Palestine, from the pro-Palestine community, who unconditionally, let's say, support Palestine, and they call out the propaganda and the reporting of the mainstream media. But when it comes to Syria, we can see that these same people are with the mainstream and with the legacy media and with the Zionist, let's say, narratives against Syria itself. How do you explain this contradiction? And what is the root cause, let's say? There are multiple causes, I believe, but how do you evaluate that?
That's a very interesting question. I mean, I think if you look at the history, the 75-year history of regime change in Syria, operations, clandestine operations by CIA and MI6, which is the organization that has consistently been weaponized against successive Syrian governments that have, let's say, alliance with Soviet Union, with Iran, that defend Palestinian resistance, that would not sacrifice their allegiances, their historic allegiances, and that includes China, of course, with the Belt and Road Initiative, that is a historical partnership goes back for centuries between Syria and China. And all of those successive governments from 1946 onwards were targeted by the Muslim Brotherhood factions inside Syria that were effective for Western foreign policy and have been used consistently and globally to destabilize, to overthrow successive governments that are not compliant with US foreign policy. If we look at the Palestinian resistance movement, of course, we have elements of Muslim Brotherhood within those resistance movements, and I include Hamas. There is also a very strong Muslim Brotherhood lobby in the United States and in the UK. And I know at the beginning of the regime change war against Syria, we were seeing, and I have many friends that suffered intimidation by Muslim Brotherhood factions in the UK when they tried to speak out about what was actually happening inside Syria and to protest the violent protests that were gathering momentum inside Syria. They were effectively intimidated and threatened by the Muslim Brotherhood factions inside the UK. And I'm sure that the same happened in the US. But sadly, I think what happened, I mean, you gave me actually the verb for it. Many people within Palestine itself, and I've been speaking to friends inside Gaza since October the 7th. And I lost many friends in Gaza when I started to speak out about the regime change war against Syria. I lost many friends in Gaza and in Egypt because they were being Al Jazeera-tized, right? we have, and that's I give you full credit for that, but it's perfect. Because we have to remember that Qatar, which is the absolute hub of the Muslim Brotherhood movement, was pouring billions into the regime change war in Syria, and it won the Palestinian resistance as a result, right?
Yes.
And even Palestinians now that I speak to in Gaza are very ignorant of what happened. They're very ignorant politically about what happened in Syria and how that affects the resistance movement, how that affects the alliance between Syria and Palestine, and how Syria, despite the betrayal of the Palestinian resistance movements, particularly Hamas, has since 2017 begun the normalization process with the Palestinian resistance. There have been changes within Hamas leadership. Sayed Nasrallah was instrumental in bringing about this normalization process, right? Because Hamas was instrumental in the destabilization campaign against Syria. We know this. Yarmouk camp was a situation engineered by Hamas to allow the entry of Al-Qaeda into the camp itself and to hold Palestinians hostage within the camp. And of course, Western media portrayed it as the Syrian army besieging the camp and killing Palestinians inside the camp. But Sharmin Nawani wrote one of the best articles ever because she took the time to go to all of these refugee camps very early on in the war. And I think the article is called Stealing Palestine. I recommend it to everyone to understand fully the role of the Muslim Brotherhood during this process of Western regime change against Syria. And so I think we have a situation where honestly many people, if they are not actually in the disinformation complex, like I would consider Celine to be, because she's been co-opted into the Syrian Emergency Task Force, but there are many people that were completely misinformed and are still being misinformed within Palestine and outside Palestine. And I think this is something that really needs to be addressed outside of the co-opted organizations, but outside that, within the Palestinian movement, because I think there are genuinely people, there were independent media outlets that were also misinformed and confused by the Muslim Brotherhood narratives. Because Muslim Brotherhood is so influential within the pro-Palestine movement, right? So there were many independent journalists that didn't cotton on for 4 or 5 years what was actually really happening in Syria. So if they were confused, then we can understand why many Palestinians were also confused, because they didn't have that broad spectrum of information. I remember, this is a personal story, but I remember in 2013, I was in Gaza during the Zionist aggression 2012. I was back there in 2013 in April at the time that Israel bombed Damascus. And it was a massive explosion, if you remember. People were even debating whether it was nuclear or tactical nukes, etc. And I remember sitting with a Hamas spokesperson at a table with friends of mine. And I asked him, you know, what was Hamas' reaction to this explosion? He said, well, what do you expect? The Syrian regime crossed Israel's red line. They supplied weapons to Hezbollah. Seriously, my jaw hit the table. And all my friends sitting around were, huh? So at this point, Hamas was influenced by Qatar, by Saudi Arabia. It was Qatari and Saudi money that was coming into Gaza at this time, right? Things since 2017 have drastically changed. Maybe the resistance is more politically aware, but the people are not.
100%. Actually, I will mention two things here. In 2014, in August 2014, I was in Damascus in Yarmouk camp on the contact line between Al-Qaeda, Nusra Front, and the Syrian side. And there was an undeclared ceasefire between the Syrian side and the Nusra side between 12 noontime to 2 p.m. We don't shoot you, you don't shoot us. But the reason for that was because the Syrian side was going to deliver food and medical aid to the Palestinian faction side. And this was when I was there and I was watching what happened to the Yarmouk camp, where I was there in 2011. And this is for the first time I mentioned this information online. I met with Tariq Hammoud. He is the son-in-law of Khalid Mash'al in Damascus. I wanted him to sponsor to bring Norman Finkelstein to Syria. So this was my initial plan in 2011 after I was in touch with Norman Finkelstein for a long time. But in 2012, when Hamas decided to leave Syria, and I mean, I was in with Tariq Hammoud in his office, and these Hamas people were like, they treat you they treat you with so respect, and they speak so like in the best words about the Syrian state, the Syrian government, and how they are grateful and everything. I couldn't believe my eyes later when I saw him on the forefront of the Twitter warriors when he escaped from Damascus to London. And you always you have to ask yourself this question: why London? And who took you to London? And how did you go to London? You know, like all of a sudden, these people just moved to London and to Qatar. And he was on the side of Mahesini and Nusra elements, and he was celebrating the death of the filth. This is what he said on Twitter. And I promised him, this was at the beginning of the war, I promised him, I said, we are going to win this war. And I hope that he is watching Syria winning this war and him being in London. And I can assure him that he will never see Damascus again in his life. So, Hekmat, speaking about this very sensitive case, you also have stories with the pro-Palestine demonstrations. You participated in some of them. I myself here in Berlin, I participated in one, and I didn't feel comfortable to go again because there were so many of the Syrian opposition people coming to these demonstrations with their green flags and calling you out for coming to the pro-Palestine demonstrations. You know, it's like you literally allied with the Israeli lobby and the Israeli side. And what is your take on these FSA flags flying in Palestine, pro-Palestine demonstrations, whether it's in DC or in Europe?
Yeah, so I've seen them now in Brussels, DC, and New York. The first one was in Brussels in October, right after the Al-Aqsa flood. And I went out with my Syrian flag and Palestinian flag. And at the end of the day, I was wearing a nice Pink Floyd shirt. It was torn up, and I had lost my flag, my Syrian flag. I was
Wow.
allowed to keep my Palestinian flag, but yeah, it was a horrible moment because right before I had been welcomed by a number of Syrians who were so happy to see the real Syrian flag, and they came to me and they said, "We're very happy to finally see a real Syrian flag in the streets of Europe in support of the Palestinian cause." So that gave me a little bit of chutzpah, and I raised the Syrian flag a little bit higher. Then bare minutes after, I got accosted by a mob of these guys, the guys who were, covering their faces and waving the green flag, the FSA flag, and I got beat up and had to lose the Syrian flag and barely made it out because these guys, it's it could have been a risk, but thankfully I made it out just with a torn shirt and a little bit of a bruise. In the United States, stateside, the same thing happens. In New York, it's less prevalent, but you always see the same guy. There's just one short guy, like 4'7" guy who's always there, and he has the same flag. It's like a Palestinian flag on one side, the FSA flag on the other side. And it's such a clear statement. He always, you find him like a puppy walking around, finding the cameras and just standing there and like switching hands as he gets tired, not even chanting anything, just there to clearly show face. Same in Washington. You see the same types that are just there, clearly SETF kinds, ACS kinds who are there. So the point is we should always be there. I know you have your taser. You should always be there with your taser, with your pepper spray, and raise the Syrian flag proud and high. We should not worry about these people. Their flag is a flag of shame, a flag of, we've seen what this flag was covering and what this flag was showing with what horrors and crimes it had inflicted on our people. So we will never accept this flag, whatever happens. And I say this all the time, even if there's a regime change, I will never accept this flag. This flag will never be a Syrian flag. So the one sentiment that I think we touched upon a little bit is a little bit of melancholy, a little bit of sadness that we're here in unison in support of a Palestinian cause that's righteous, and you're gonna put your own sectarian, vengeful desires ahead of any form of unity that could propel our movement altogether forward. It's essentially a sad, mournful sentiment to see that these people are so corrupt within, so hateful, that they're putting Sunni sectarian divide ahead of their interest in liberating Palestine.
Exactly. Actually, I just want to mention that my experience with only this type of people is very negative because, first of all, I don't know them. Even if I see them in the street, I don't recognize faces. Like, who are you? I don't know, but they come to me because they know me. And usually they don't come one by one, and they usually come a mob together. Like it's like in a jungle law, they don't dare to come one by one. Although I carry a taser all the time with me, and I learned also how to break some jaws recently by learning kickboxing and self-defense. But still, it's a moment that I know that they could come from my back. So I'm always careful about these cases, and walking in the street among thousands of people in a demonstration, it's very risky, unfortunately, for me, because they know me and my face is unfortunately a little bit unique. Like if they see my beard from 100 meters, they would just come to beat me up. So I don't want to risk that. I am in full support of the Palestinian liberation movement. I'm in full support of the Palestinian rights. I'm in full support of the Palestinian nationhood. And I would only add that the people who are carrying these flags are Trojan horses and the fifth columns among the pro-Palestinian liberation movement. I am completely, wholeheartedly ready to accept them again when they abandon the American regime change war in Syria and they come and join just like any other Syrian. I'm ready to again forgive for what happened in Syria, because there is no other way for us to continue. But as long as they are collaborating with this, we discussed today, this topic was very important, like they're directly collaborating with the Zionist representatives in the House or in the Senate, and they are issuing laws that serve the Israeli interest in Syria and not the interest of the Syrian people, then we have to call them what they are, traitors. And I hope the people of these organizations are watching us, especially from the Syria Emergency Task Force and the Syrian American Council, because they do, and accordingly they block me on social media platforms. And this was our today's topic, guys. All the relevant links of Vanessa and Hekmat, guys, their accounts on X and their podcasts, their work, their Substack is in the description below. I see some of the comments say I didn't find Hekmat on Twitter, but I put the link in the description below so you can hit him a follow. And Vanessa's work, very important on Substack. Also, you can hit her a follow. Vanessa and Hekmat, thank you very much for being with me today on this live streaming. It was great chatting with you and speaking about this very important case.
Thank you, Kevork.
Thanks,
Guys,
Kevork.
you are so welcomed. Guys, I will do another live streaming tomorrow. Tomorrow is Friday, 5 p.m. Central European time. So stay tuned, subscribe, hit the like button before you leave this video. That would be great for me to navigate through the algorithm of YouTube. And if you like to support my independent work, you can see the link scrolling on the screen, patreon.com/Syriana Analysis. And I will see you tomorrow. Peace be upon you. Salam.